Werewolf trials. Shapeshifters in medieval courts. The Middle Ages were haunted by shadows, by plague, famine, war, and fire. But beyond the tangible horrors of hunger and disease lurked something stranger, more elusive, the terror of the beast within. For in the minds of many medieval people, men could change into wolves. This was not mere legend. In village after village, in courtroom after courtroom, real trials were held. Men and women stood accused not just of crimes, but of becoming something other than human. The werewolf was not just a monster of folklore, but a creature that stalked the very halls of justice. Long before Hollywood gave us the full moon and silver bullets, the werewolf lived in the imagination of medieval Europe. To the peasant scratching out a living on the edge of the forest, wolves were the embodiment of fear itself. They stole sheep and cattle. They prowled the winter night, their howls echoing through the dark. To be devoured by wolves was a real, visceral terror. And so, when murders occurred, when children went missing, when mutilated bodies were found in the woods, suspicion turned not just toward animals, but toward neighbors. Anyone could be a wolf in disguise. The roots of these beliefs were ancient. Norse sagas spoke of berserkers, men who donned wolfskins and became something more than human, wild and unstoppable. In classical antiquity, the Greek legend of Lycaon told of a man transformed into a wolf for daring to feed human flesh to Zeus. In the folk traditions of Europe, shapeshifters were a constant presence. Witches, demons, and cursed men could slip into animal form. And by the late Middle Ages, when superstition mixed with law, these stories entered the courtroom. One of the earliest recorded cases comes from France in the 15th century. In the town of Poligny, villagers discovered the bodies of children horribly mutilated. Rumors spread quickly. This was not the work of ordinary wolves. No, this was a man in wolf's form, preying on his neighbors. A tailor was accused, and under interrogation he confessed, not only to murder but to transformation. He claimed he had an ointment, given by the devil himself, that let him become a wolf. In this guise he had hunted and killed. Whether this confession came from belief, from madness, or from torture, the result was the same. He was executed, burned alive as both murderer and monster. Cases like this multiplied. The boundaries between witchcraft and lycanthropy blurred. To the medieval mind, both were bound up with pacts with the devil, with maleficium, evil magic. In some regions, especially in France and the Holy Roman Empire, trials for werewolves became almost as common as those for witches. Whole communities lived in fear of the shapeshifter. The wolf in the woods was dangerous enough, but the idea that your neighbor could shed his skin and become a beast, that was terror beyond reason. Perhaps the most infamous of all these trials was that of Peter Stump, sometimes called the Werewolf of Bedburg. In 1589, long after the medieval period but still steeped in its worldview, Stump was accused in Germany of a staggering list of crimes. He was said to have an enchanted belt that turned him into a wolf. As a beast, he supposedly murdered men, women, and children, even his own kin. His confession, extracted under torture, spoke of 25 years of devilish transformation. The court condemned him to a horrific death. He was strapped to a wheel, his flesh torn with red-hot pincers, his limbs broken, and finally his body burned. The people of Bedburg watched as justice, in their eyes, was done. To modern ears, his story sounds like myth. But to those villagers, the werewolf was as real as hunger or plague. Yet Stump was not alone. In Livonia, in the far reaches of the Baltic, werewolf trials took on an even stranger character. There, peasants accused of lycanthropy sometimes insisted not that they were evil, but that they were hounds of God. They claimed that on certain nights, they and others like them transformed and descended into hell itself to battle demons, to bring back fertility to the land. Here the werewolf was not a servant of Satan, but a defender of humanity. The courts, however, were seldom persuaded. Confessions of transformation, whether framed as good or evil, were met with punishment. In France, the werewolf panic reached such heights that official proclamations were made. In 1521, 2 men in Poligny confessed under torture to transforming into wolves with the aid of ointments. They admitted to killing children, to tearing their flesh as beasts. They were executed, burned alive as both murderers and werewolves. In 1573, in Dole, another man named Gilles Garnier was accused of attacking children in the form of a wolf. Villagers testified that they had seen a wolf near the scenes of murders. Garnier himself, under pressure, confessed to being that wolf. He too was burned. The courts of Europe treated these confessions not as madness, but as proof. To the judges and inquisitors, the devil was real. Witches were real. Why not werewolves? If men could fly on broomsticks, why not run on all fours? The law adapted itself to belief, and belief fed on fear. The forests of Europe were vast, filled with wolves. The line between man and beast seemed thin. And so, in towns and villages, whenever savagery struck, suspicion fell on those who seemed different, who lived alone, who muttered to themselves, or who bore strange scars. To the accused, the pressure was immense. Torture was common, and under agony men confessed to things they could scarcely have imagined. Some believed their own words. In a world where demons and angels battled daily for souls, it was not impossible to believe you had been cursed, that your own body was not fully your own. The wolf inside was not just a metaphor. It was an explanation for impulses, for violence, for the darkness men carried with them. And beneath the trials lay a deeper symbolism. The wolf was hunger, wilderness, untamed rage. To call someone a werewolf was to say they had abandoned the bonds of Christian society, that they had given themselves over to savagery. The werewolf trials were, in a sense, trials of humanity itself. Could men fall so low as to become beasts? The court said yes, and they punished accordingly. Even children were not spared. In some regions, entire families were suspected. A father accused of lycanthropy might see his sons and daughters dragged before the bench as well. If the bloodline was tainted, the wolf might run through it. Madness, possession, or simple desperation. Any could be cast as proof of the beast within. The courts sought to root it out with fire and rope. Not every region saw such hysteria. In England, for instance, werewolf trials were rare. Wolves themselves had been hunted nearly to extinction, and the folklore never took deep root. But in France, in Germany, in the Baltic lands, the werewolf prowled the courts for centuries. Even as the witch trials faded, stories of men changing into beasts lingered. The Enlightenment would eventually dismiss them as superstition. But for those who lived and died in the shadow of the wolf, it was no superstition at all. What drove these beliefs? Some historians point to clinical lycanthropy, a rare psychological disorder in which individuals believe themselves to be animals. Others suggest ergot poisoning, hallucinogenic molds growing on rye, could have fueled visions of transformation. Still others argue that the werewolf trials were simply another form of witch hunting, a way for communities to explain violence and death. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same. Countless men and women executed, their deaths justified by the belief that they were more beast than human. And so, the medieval world lived in fear of wolves not only with fur, but with human faces. At night, when the wind carried the howls of the forest, villagers shivered not just at the thought of hungry animals, but at the idea that their own neighbor might slip out the door, shed his skin, and join the pack. The wolf was not outside the walls, it was within them. The werewolf trials remind us of the power of belief, of how fear can warp justice, how myth can become law. In those dimly lit courtrooms, Under the gaze of judges and priests, men confessed to becoming monsters. They died for it, screaming in fire, their neighbors watching in horror and relief. The beast was slain, the village safe. Until the next cry in the night, the next child missing, the next body torn apart. The Middle Ages were a world of shadows, where the boundaries between natural and supernatural blurred, where the wolf prowled not just the forests, but the human imagination. And in the courts of that world, the werewolf stood trial, not as a legend, but as a reality. A reality that ended in fire, rope, and blood.